Hello and welcome to my video all about how to knit diamond shapes. Now if you've been following along with my previous knitting lessons, I've covered a lot of increase and decrease techniques, and knitting diamonds is a great way to put those into practice. I'm going to show you 3 different types of diamond. The first one is just a basic diamond shape in stockinette stitch. The second is also in stockinette stitch and is more like a leaf shape. And the third is in garter stitch and is a bit more square in shape. So the first diamond shape I'm going to show you how to knit is just a classic and quite plain diamond shape in stockinette stitch. For the increase techniques you're going to be doing the make one left and the make one right. For the decreases we're going to be doing the SSK and the K2 tog. The very first step is to cast on 3 stitches. I'm using straight needles as well as double knit or worsted yarn. However, you can of course use whichever needles and yarn you wish. I cast on using the long tail casting on method. And then for the first row, I just purl. And this is going to be the same every other row. So every odd numbered row is just going to be a purl row. In this case, the purls represent the back of the diamond shape. So that's 3 purl stitches. And then we move on to row 2. For this row we're going to increase the stitches from 3 to 5. To do this we're going to knit 1 stitch. The next step is to do a make one right. If you don't know how to do a make one right or a make one left, be sure to have a look at my other video which goes into detail about this method. I will link to it here. So for the make one right, you take your left hand needle from back to front underneath the piece of yarn which lies between the 2 needles. And you then knit into the front of the loop that you have just formed. And that has increased the overall number of stitches by 1. We now move on to another knit stitch. So just 1 regular knit stitch there, and then a make one left. For a make one left you take your left hand needle from front to back this time underneath that yarn that runs between the 2 needles. You then knit into the back of that loop that you've just created. So you take your right hand needle down through the back of that loop and do a normal knit stitch from that point. And then finally you finish with a knit stitch again. So that second row is knit 1, make 1 right, knit 1, make 1 left, and then knit 1. So overall we've increased the number of stitches on the needles by 2, going from 3 stitches to 5. And then we do another purl row for row 3. Row number 4, we again start with a knit stitch. And again we do a make one right. So you take your left hand needle back to front and then knit through the front of that loop. Then you knit 3 stitches. Notice how all these rows are symmetrical in design. You then do a make one left, taking the left hand needle from front to back and then knitting into the back of the loop. And then finally a knit stitch. Row 5 is of course a purl row again. You should start to notice a pattern emerging in the knit rows now, because the first 2 stitches and the last 2 stitches always stay the same. It's just the central number of knit stitches that changes on each row. So now we move on to row number 6. We again start with a knit stitch and then a make one right. All of the increased rows begin in exactly the same way. You then do 5 knit stitches. So basically what you're doing is knitting until you just have one stitch left on the left hand needle. And then you do a make one left, taking the needle front to back and then knitting through the back of the loop, and then doing a final knit stitch. So from here on out you'll probably be able to guess the pattern of each knit row, because they always start the same with a knit one and a make one right, and they always end the same with a make one left and a knit one, and then in between is just knit stitches. And that's all there is to it for each knit row. And then of course between each knit row it's just a purl row like I'm doing now. So here I've just done row 7, which is just a purl row. I'm now going to switch the camera off and do rows 8 through to 13. So 8, 10 and 12 will be knit rows, 9, 11 and 13 will be purl rows. I'm just going to put the pattern up on the screen now, which is what I'm going to be following, but I don't want to put it all on camera because it'll just end up being a really long video. Once I've done that, I will return and start the decrease rows. You can of course keep going in the same manner for as long as you want, depending on how big you want the diamond to be. Once you've done all the increase rows you want to do and you've finished on a purl row, then you can move on to doing the decrease rows, which is what I'm going to do next. So to begin, and this is my row 14, I'm going to do an SSK decrease. SSK stands for slip, slip, knit, and is a single decrease. So to do an SSK, you take your right hand needle and slip one stitch off the left hand needle knitwise with the yarn at the back of the needles. And then you repeat that. So you slip the stitch knitwise. You then take your left hand needle down through the front of those stitches that you just slipped. So you take your left hand needle down the front of those slip stitches, crossing the needles, and then just doing a normal knit stitch in order to knit those slip stitches together. Like so. So you've gone from 2 stitches on the left to 1 stitch on the right hand needle. You then just knit until there are only 2 stitches left on the left hand needle. So you knit all the way along until there are only 2 stitches left, and then you're going to do a K2 tog, which is a knit 2 together stitch. So you go up through both of those stitches on the left hand needle and knit those together. And that again is a single decrease, so overall the number of stitches has reduced by 2 on that row. Just the same as when you were doing the increase rows, you're going to be doing a purl row in between each knit row again. So now is a purl row. Once you've done that purl row, you repeat exactly the same again. So you do an SSK, so you slip 2 stitches knitwise and then knit those 2 stitches together. And then you knit until you only have 2 stitches left, and then do a K2 tog by knitting those 2 stitches together. And then once again it's a purl row. And just repeat those 2 rows over and over until you only have 3 stitches remaining overall. Then, making sure that you've just done a purl row, you then do an SSK. So slip, slip and knit those 2 together. Then knit 1 stitch. And then pass the SSK stitch over the knit stitch that you've just done. So you take your left hand needle, pick up the SSK stitch that you did first, lift it over the knit stitch above it and off the needle, making sure that that knit stitch stays on the right hand needle. You can use your thumbnail to help you. And that leaves you with just one stitch remaining. So you then cut the excess yarn off, so you have at least 6 to 8 inches left, and then you pass that yarn through that last remaining stitch and pull tight to secure. Then you would obviously use a yarn needle to weave in the yarn tails. And that's diamond shape number 1 completed. Obviously, because it's stockinette stitch, it does have a tendency to curl up, as shown here, but a bit later on in the video, after the next diamond shape, I will show you how to steam the shape with an iron to keep it nice and flat. As you can see, the stockinette stitch all goes one way in this shape, whereas in the next 2 shapes you'll see that the stitches lie in different directions. Diamonds are a great shape to knit when you're a beginner because they really teach you about increases and decreases, how they look on the finished article, and also how they're paired up together on the same rows. So for instance, in that first diamond shape, make one left and make one right were paired up, which is quite a common occurrence. And on the decrease rows, SSK and K2 tog were paired up, which again is a fairly common occurrence because the SSK is left leaning and the K2 tog is right leaning, and so they kind of balance each other out and make the whole shape look a bit more symmetrical. Okay, so let's move on to diamond shape number 2. The first steps of this diamond shape are exactly the same as the last shape. So you first cast on 3 stitches and you then do a purl row. So you do 3 purl stitches. Just like the first diamond, every other row is going to be a purl row, and the purl rows represent the wrong side or the back of the diamond shape. We're then on to row 2, which is the first of the knit rows. We start off with a regular knit stitch, and then we do a KFBF. To do a KFBF, you take your right hand needle up through the top stitch on the left hand needle, just as you would for a normal knit stitch, and you do all the steps of a normal knit stitch up until the point where you would normally push that stitch off the top of the needle. Instead, you swing the right hand needle around to the back of the left hand needle. You then knit into the back of that top stitch. You take the right hand needle down through the back of that top stitch and then carry on as if it were a normal knit stitch again. So wrap the yarn, bring the needle through to the front, and then again you don't push that stitch off. As a last step, you knit into the front of the stitch one more time. So you take your right hand needle up through the front of that stitch and then complete the stitch as if it were a normal knit stitch. So wrap the yarn, bring the needle through to the front and push the stitch off. That increases the number of stitches by 2, so it's a double increase. And to finish that row, you do another regular knit stitch. So row 2 is knit 1, KFBF, which means knit front, back and front again, and then a knit 1 to finish. Row 3 is of course a purl row. For row 4, we start with a knit 1. So we do 1 knit stitch, and then we do a KFB. Now the KFB is easier than the KFBF we did in the previous row, and from here on in, the only increase we'll be doing is the KFB. To do a KFB, you do all the steps of a normal knit stitch, except you don't push that stitch off the top of the needle. Instead, you swing the right hand needle around to the back and knit into the back of that top stitch. And complete it like you would a normal knit stitch. And push the stitch off the needle. And that's a single increase. And then you do a normal knit stitch. and then you do a KFB again. Once again, note that all of these knit rows are symmetrical in design. And then to finish, you do a knit 1. So row 4 is knit 1, KFB, which means knit front and back, knit 1, KFB, knit 1. And then you do a purl row again for row 5. For row 6, we start with a knit 1 again. And from here on in, every increase row will now start and finish in exactly the same way. So every knit row is going to start with knit 1, KFB, and end with KFB, knit 1. Row 6 is no different, so we've knit 1 stitch and now we're doing a KFB. We then do normal knit stitches along the row until we only have 2 stitches remaining on the left hand needle. In this case, we knit 3 stitches. Then we do a KFB and knit 1 to finish. And then a purl row. I'm sure you'll be able to work out from now on how to do each increase row, because they're always basically the same. You do a knit 1, then a KFB, then you knit until you only have 2 stitches left on the left hand needle, and then you do a KFB and a knit 1. It's only the central section of knit stitches that changes between the rows. Each time it increases by 2 knit stitches. I'm now going to do rows 8 till 13, where 13 will be a purl row, and then come back to you. I'm just putting up the pattern for those rows on the video now, just to guide you if you need it. So now we're on to row 14, and this will be the first row of the decreases. And this is where the knitting starts to reduce in width again, as we reduce the number of stitches on the needle. By the way, if you want to make a bigger diamond than what I'm making here, feel free to do as many increase rows as you want before switching to these decrease rows. Okay, so row 14. We're first going to knit 6 stitches. We then do an S2 KPO, which is a centered double decrease. To do this, you slip 2 stitches together, knitwise, off the left hand needle. You then do 1 knit stitch. You then take your left hand needle and use it to pick up the 2 stitches that you just slipped and pass them over the stitch that you just knit. So you take 2 stitches up and over that last stitch that you knit and let them go off the end of the needle. Make sure you keep that knit stitch on the right hand needle, using your thumbnail to help you if you need to. So now you've done an S2 KPO that has decreased the number of stitches by 2 overall. And you then do 6 knit stitches to finish. As you'll notice, it's a symmetrical row with 6 knit stitches to start and finish, and a centered double decrease occurring over the 3 central stitches. Row 15 is a purl row. Then we move on to row 16, and again we're going to do an S2 KPO over the central 3 stitches, and every other stitch will be a knit stitch. So we start with 5 knit stitches this time, and then we do an S2 KPO again. So we slip 2 stitches, do a knit stitch, and then pass those slip stitches over the knit stitch and off the end of the needle, reducing 3 stitches down to just 1. And then you do 5 knit stitches to finish the row. And then row 17 is a purl row. I'm now going to do rows 18 through to 23 and then come back to show you the last few rows. The increased knit rows are basically the same every time because you're just doing an S2 KPO right in the middle of each row, and then just doing knit stitches either side of it. And then of course a purl row every other row. Okay, so I've just done row 23, which was a purl row, and now I have 5 stitches left, and I'm going to begin row 24. The first stitch, as usual, is a knit stitch. And then over the next 3 stitches we do an S2 KPO. And then knit the final stitch. And then we do a purl row, so purl 3 stitches for row 25, and then row 26, because we've only got 3 stitches left, is just going to be an S2 KPO. So slip 2, knit 1, and then pass the slip stitches over. And that'll give us just 1 single stitch remaining on the right hand needle. Then all we need to do is just bind off by cutting off the excess yarn to leave a tail of at least 6 to 8 inches, and then take that yarn tail through the last remaining stitch and pull tight. To finish the diamond, you will of course use a yarn needle to weave the yarn tails in. And there you go, that's diamond number 2 finished. As you can see, the S2 KPOs are very prominent and form a line on the top half of the shape. This is what makes this shape look a bit like a leaf. Because it's been formed by alternating knit rows and purl rows, you end up with stockinette stitch. And you can see the stockinette stitches pointing downwards and curving from the top of the diamond to the bottom. This gives it a nice organic feel. However, because it is made of stockinette stitch, it does have the tendency to curl. And very shortly I'll be showing you how to use an iron to steam your shapes flat. If we look at the increase section of the diamond, we can tell straight away that we used KFBs as the increase method, because KFBs are visible increases and produce a prominent horizontal bar of yarn on your work, which you can see here along the edges. I quite like that look, but some people really don't like how visible it is on your knitting. The Make One increases that we used in the previous diamond are a bit more subtle. As you can see though, the overall shape looks pretty symmetrical, and I'm pleased with the result. If I show you a previous one of these shapes that I made, I put the KFBs right at the beginning and right at the end of the increase rows, rather than doing a knit stitch first and last. This led to an unsymmetrical finish, because the start of a KFB, or one side of the KFB if you like, looks a bit different to the other. If we look at the right hand side, you can see that you get a nice braided edge, nice and neat and smooth, whereas on the left hand side you get more of a bobbly edge. And these are obviously very different, and that's not what you want. So that's just something to bear in mind. You don't want to put a KFB at the end of a row. And now we move on to steaming the shapes. So if you're doing stockinette shapes, then you might find that the curling is not what you want, and you want to make them sit flat. So what I do is quite simply get a clean tea towel, put some water on it so it's slightly damp. You want to wring out any excess water, and then you put that tea towel on your ironing board. You then put the stockinette shape on top of the tea towel, and then fold the tea towel over the top of it, so the shape is sandwiched inside the tea towel. You put the iron on a low heat setting, because the last thing you want to do is melt the yarn, and since I'm using an acrylic yarn, that's a very real possibility. Another thing you don't want to do is press the iron down hard on top of your shape, because that is going to squash and flatten the shape, and it's just going to lose all of its lovely fluffiness that you want to keep. So you don't want it as flat as a pancake, you just want to sort of hover the iron over the top of the tea towel so that the steam goes into the shape. Now you want to do this only briefly, and then check your shape, and just keep checking every 10 seconds or so at most. You don't want to hold the iron over the top of it for too long or press it down. Once you're happy, then simply stop ironing. And now we move on to the last diamond shape, which is more of a square shape than the previous two, and is also in garter stitch rather than stockinette stitch. As you can see, the garter stitch goes in separate directions on each half of the diamond, and there is a line down the centre. The purpose of doing 3 different diamonds is just to make you practice different increase and decrease techniques, and to also see how you can go about making the same sort of shape in so many different ways. And that's one of the important things to learn about knitting, that there are so many different ways to get the same result. Okay, so we first cast on 25 stitches. The first row and every odd numbered row represents the wrong side or the back of the diamond. But unlike the previous 2 diamonds, the odd numbered sides are not just purl rows. They're going to change as we go along. So for row 1, we knit all of the stitches except the last one, which will be a purl. So we knit 24 stitches, and then we purl 1 stitch to finish the row. We then move on to row 2, which is when we start knitting the right side or the front of the diamond. The first stitch is a slip stitch. You're going to slip 1 stitch knitwise. So you take your right hand needle into that stitch as if to knit it, but then just push that stitch off as it is onto the right hand needle. You then knit 10 stitches. So now we've reached the central 3 stitches, and this is where the line that will appear down the centre of the diamond will be created. And we're going to do an SK2PO. Now to do an SK2PO, you slip a stitch knitwise, and then you do a K2 tog. So you knit the next 2 stitches together, and then you use your left hand needle to pick up the stitch that you slipped, carry it over the K2 tog that you just did, and drop it off the needle. Make sure you keep the K2 tog stitch on the right hand needle, using your thumbnail if necessary. And that's an SK2PO, which is a double decrease. You're then going to do another 10 knit stitches. And to finish will be 1 purl stitch. If you're wondering why almost all of the rows in this pattern start with a slip stitch and end with a purl stitch, that's because that combination creates a really nice, neat edge. So with pretty much any flat knitting pattern you want to do, if you add a slip stitch at the beginning of each row and a purl stitch at the end of each row, you'll add a really neat edge to your knitted project. So that's just a handy little tip for you, which you can take forward into future knitting projects. Okay, so now we're on to row 3. This row and all future odd numbered rows are now going to be the same. So I'm only going to do this row once, and then that will be repeated every other row. The first step is to slip a stitch knitwise, and then you simply knit until the very last stitch on the row, which you then purl. So that's slip a stitch knitwise, knit to the last stitch, and then purl 1. And that's going to be the same for every odd numbered row from now on. And now we move on to row 4. So once again we slip a stitch knitwise to start, then we knit 9 stitches, and now we've reached the central 3 stitches, so we're going to do an SK2PO. So you slip a stitch knitwise, Do a K2 tog by knitting the next 2 stitches together, and then pass the slip stitch over the K2 tog and off the needle. And there you've done your double decrease. You then knit 9 more stitches and finish with 1 purl stitch. For row 5, it's going to be the same as I outlined in row 3, which is where you slip a stitch knitwise, knit until the last stitch, and then purl a stitch. And that will bring us to row 6. However, I'm not going to show row 6 through to 20 on camera because it would make the video extremely long, so I'm just going to go away and do those rows on my own. I'm going to put the pattern up on the screen now as a guide to help you so you can follow along, and I'm going to come back when I only have 3 stitches remaining on the needles. So once I get down to 3 stitches, I will stop and switch the camera back on and show you how to finish this diamond shape. The only thing that changes row to row is the number of knit stitches you have to do. So there's no point really repeating myself over and over. So I'll now go and do rows 6 through to 20 and come back shortly. Okay, so I now have 3 stitches remaining on my needles and I'm about to do the last odd numbered row. So we're going to slip a stitch knitwise as usual, then just a single knit stitch and then a purl stitch. So now we're on the very last row, which is an even numbered row, and all we do on this last row is an SK2PO. So we slip 1 knitwise, do a K2 tog, then take the slip stitch over the top of the K2 tog and off the needle, leaving just 1 stitch remaining. You're now going to cut off the excess yarn to leave you with a tail of 6 to 8 inches at least, and then take that yarn tail through the remaining stitch and pull tight. To finish, you'll of course use a yarn needle to weave those yarn tails into the back of your work. And then you've finished. That's diamond shape number 3 completed. As you can see, there's the central line that consists of the SK2PO double decreases, and then either side has garter stitch that runs in different directions. So that shows you 3 different ways of going about making a diamond shape. I really hope that this video has been interesting and useful to you, and thank you very much for watching.